I copied a couple of chapters of what?
I'm sorry.
In the cord. Jake, no. Sit in the desk.
Just this one time?
No.
Okay, we're
Time
here.
sick.
You always need to.
All right.
I don't know.
So what we're going to look at, and this is a lot of information, and most of it is not like Euro board type of stuff, meaning they're not really trying to test you on Asian history. They're not really trying to test you on Middle Eastern history as much, but it's a little bit more of an interest at least. These two chapters are kind of combined together, but I'm going to show you where they are. And so that if you want any of this background information, or if there's anything that we talk about at the beginning that you didn't really quite get, go into the miscellaneous folder, and this is called CPP 27 and 28. And it gives you a background really of all of these different regions, Africa, the Middle East, India, China, Japan, Persia, and a handful of others, and looking at the history once they have this interaction with the Europeans. And some of it I'm going to gloss over, some of it I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, but it's all in detail in those two chapters and so forth. If you do have an interest in that, hello, welcome. It's a lot of food.
A lot of food.
Sure.
And sure.
It's a very large Jimmy John's. Did you just get a piece of bread?
Stale bread.
Awesome. All right, back to the notes then. And so what we're looking at is responses. Responses are, there has been some kind of infiltration into these great states. India, it's been going on for a long time. You could almost make an argument that it's been going on since Muslim expansion, in the late Middle Ages. And then it was the Portuguese, then it was the Dutch, then it was the French, then it was the British, and so when we kind of pick up the story, it's the British. And the British East India Company has been kind of controlling Indian affairs, at least from the 1750s on. India is still controlled, for all practical purposes, by this Mughal dynasty, which had been around for a while. The Mughal emperor is the nominal leader of the country, but the real leader of the country, kind of like saying Cuba, after 1898, is still controlled by Cubans. But that's not really the truth. The Cubans are more or less being told what to do and how to do it by American companies and American influence. And that's kind of the scenario that India finds itself in from the 1700s into the 1800s. And so that's really what it's about. The British East India Company kind of using India as a basis to, kind of make sure that it's projecting its economic, its cultural influence and its economic power. So when we finally get back to India, we fast forward about 100 years, and there's a mention that there were some things that were done in India that were at least, I guess, useful. They call this like dual control, and so what they said is some local rulers accepted the British East India Company's rule, others resisted, but that, for the most part, British influence in India was set up for the purpose of benefiting British economic might, if you will, especially as they industrialize, especially as they're looking for foreign markets for their textiles and everything else. That's kind of what's going down. It says the system of dual control lasted until 1858, brought several benefits to the peninsula, especially to women. One of them was this practice called sati, or S-A, it's pronounced sati, but it's spelled S-A-T-I. And this was where supposedly there was a common practice in India where women were burning themselves in funeral pyres, kind of burning themselves when their husbands, die. Which seems kind of, I don't know, strange, but they outlawed that practice. Like the British saw it and they were like, what the, is that? And they said that's probably not good. Women don't necessarily need to commit suicide the moment that their husbands die. The other one was that there was a lot, because the country itself was so large and was broken into so many different groups and so many different tribal divisions and so many different religious divisions, that it was very difficult to kind of control the interior. And they had this group, basically, it was sort of like white-collar criminals. The word thug actually comes from an Indian practice called thugi, all right, which was supposedly this bandit murder type, like roving groups, almost like anarchists, or if you will, that were kind of roving the countryside, and then they would beat the crap out of people, and then they would ask for protection. And that was sort of a, almost like Old West kind of thing, that when the British East India Company came in, probably not caring that there was a lot of victims in that, but that their trade would be upset. So they outlawed that practice, and it created an element of stability and kept some of the tribal divisions and some of the religious divisions from kind of boiling over into civil war. So those were good things that happened. Okay? But the incident that finally gets the Indian subcontinent, I guess, sick of the British is this thing called the Sepoy Mutiny. Has anybody ever heard of it? All right, what's it about, Salim?
It was that the Indian military got upset that the British were apparently using animal fats like pig fat and cow fat in order to grease the cartridges, and
Yes.
because they had to use their teeth and mouths to rip the cartridges off, that would mean that all of them were going to hell.
That means all of them, yeah. I mean, Muslims, first of all, had the pig as this defiled creature that could not be touched. Hindus had the cow as a sacred animal that also ought not be touched. So you've effectively pissed off everyone in India with this idea that the Sepoys, which was the British East India Company's military, that was made up mostly of Hindu and Muslim fighters, that when they started doing these training exercises, they got familiar with the fact that the cartridges themselves that went into guns were greased, and that they were greased with pig fat or cow fat, and that was enough to finally set them off. But that's like a spark. After just being, humiliated and more or less utilized for the benefit of this small hand of British traitors, they finally kind of hit their mark and said, enough is enough. And there's this great uprising against British control called the Sepoy Mutiny. The name that the Indians gave it was the Great Rebellion of 1857. That kind of ends the Mughal dynasty as this sort of like show political thing, because then the British just came in and then outright controlled it. So once the Sepoy Mutiny is beaten down, then it's almost like a military governorship led by the British takes over and really is there until India gets its independence. And there's a lot of things that kind of go on, sort of throughout the course of that. But just here's a couple of things that they mention. Under the new system, the Governor General gained additional duties and a new title, Viceroy. Viceroy was responsible to the Secretary of State for India in the British Cabinet. In the subcontinent, the British maintained direct control of most of the high positions in government, while Indians were trained to carry out administrative responsibilities in provincial and subordinate systems. London reorganized the courts and law codes along with the army and public services. English became the administrative language of the country. India was governed for and by the British, who viewed themselves as the only people capable of ruling. They mentioned that in 1900, 90% of native men and 99% of native women were illiterate. Few schools existed at the village level to remedy the situation. The masses of the rural poor paid for the government through taxes on beverages and salt. And there is going to be this major thing that happens in the turn of the century called the Salt Marches, which was another rebellion kind of against the fact that the British had imposed this heavy tax on salt. India provided rich resources and vast markets for the British. In return, the British supplied improved health standards, better water systems, and political stability. There was more unity in the country, they mentioned, but, it's Britain with a handful of people that are controlling almost 300 million people. And so it's not surprising. It does say that there is a mass illiteracy, and that's a benefit. Okay? The already kind of formidable Indian caste system, the British utilized more or less as a means of allowing the upper classes to kind of subordinate the lower classes. Always good to take advantage of a good feudal system if it exists. And the British were able to do that. The problem is that the upper castes in India are treated like subordinates. And that's not a role that they're used to playing, particularly when it's British tradesmen, you know, that are kind of utilizing these folks as personal servants or whatever the case. So there was a lot of animosity between the more noble castes in India and some of the British, and their interactions were always kind of, you know, not volatile, but certainly there was sort of like a reserved anger about the thing that was taking place. Then you're going to get people like Gandhi, or like Jinnah, or like Nehru. These are folks that are ultimately going to be educated in Western schools, and they're going to start realizing the hypocrisy that is being dealt out to them. And ultimately, in 1885, there is sort of like a slow but maturing Indian nationalist group that forms called the Indian National Congress. And so as you approach World War I, it's very clear that India is controlled by the British, for the British, by the British, etc., but that the seeds for its own destruction, or the seeds for decolonization, are already present. And that's kind of what you have to keep in mind. It's very similar to what's happening in Egypt. Okay? Egypt was sort of like cursorily controlled by the British and by British companies, but then, you know, they had an uprising because they finally realized that the British were completely manipulating them and making most of the people suffer in poverty while the British, you know, kind of increased their investments and everything else, and that the leadership itself had more or less become puppets to British control. Then they had their big uprising, which was led by this guy named Colonel Arabi, and we'll talk about it in a second. And then the British kind of said, well, let's stop playing games. We really control this country, and now we really will control this country. As a military, you know, type of arrangement, we'll put a British general in charge of the country. So India has viceroy, Egypt has military governor, and functionally the same thing's happening. Where Britain says, you know, we're going to kind of seize control here, and it'll be a temporary thing, and eventually we'll turn over power, but then they never did. And it was similar to India. Okay, China's a big deal here. This is a massive country, very, very old, established political systems. This was a real humiliation for China because they've always kind of ran their own show. And for the British to come in, get the population hooked on opium, then defeat the Chinese in a bunch of wars, and then allow all of these other people, French and Russian and Japanese and American and German, to start coming in and carving a whole bunch of influence and favorable trade relationships and everything else, is a real smack on the Chinese psyche. And it was kind of like where Russia was when Napoleon encountered Russia. And Russia kind of came to that realization that we need to roll, we need to make some changes, and if we don't, we're done. We're in real trouble. And China is at that crossroads where you're either going to modernize or you're not. And unfortunately for China, they chose to not. And it's not that there weren't, you know, native Chinese that were saying we need to get going here, we need to make some modernization of our armed forces, we need to get rid of the Mandarin aristocracy, we need constitutional government. We have a whole bunch of internal reforms that we need to make, or these coyotes on the outside are going to continue to carve us up. And the coyotes, of course, are the Europeans. You know, I get it from the Coyote and the Roadrunner cartoons. You know, where the Roadrunner goes by, and then like they kind of like still life it, and then they show the Roadrunner, and then they put like a little caption underneath them, and then they go to the Coyote, and then they still life the Coyote, and then they put a little caption under the Coyote. And then the Coyote looks at the Roadrunner, and then he looks at the Roadrunner again, and it kind of bubbles out. And then the Roadrunner is like, you know, looks like a turkey with peas and potatoes under glass. And then all of a sudden the Coyote has a bib on and a knife and a fork, and then he chooses to chase the Roadrunner. That's kind of where the Europeans are right now. Okay? They got bib on, they got knife in one hand, fork in the other. The Roadrunner is China. Only difference is China gets caught and eaten a lot. So, anyway, So if you see this, and like I said, I call it post-Opium War mortem. This was sort of the place where they're at their crossroads, and what do they decide to do? And unfortunately, nothing. They kind of had an absolute monarchy that was very, very slow to make the internal reforms that were necessary. There is a woman that arrives on the scene in China. By the time she gets to, power, her nickname had kind of changed over the years. Her name was, let's see, how many different names this woman had. There she is. Okay. It says, after the external buffeting from the West and the internal uprising, meaning the Taiping Rebellion that we talked about in class the other day, the Manchu dynasty limped along for another half-century, led by a conservative coalition of Manchu and Chinese officials who advised the Empress Dowager Cixi, all right, which is now spelled Cixi. All right, they changed the way that they had always, spelled these names, but it used to be Cixi spelled this way, now it's spelled this way, Cixi. How did she become the Empress Dowager? What is a dowager, by the way? What do you think it is?
Puppet.
It's like Catherine de Medici. Remember her? Okay. The only thing that she did was bear the Chinese emperor a son, because the legit queens or empresses did not. She was a concubine. Does anybody know what a concubine is?
Yeah.
Okay. So she was trained basically to serve the emperor. And there was a whole bunch of them, right? But she was a little bit better than most and was able to use her concubinage as a personal means of advancement. And she finally got to a place where she bore the king or the emperor a son, and nobody else was able to do that. So that son is the heir to the throne, and then future sons would be the heir to the throne. And then she was able to kind of use that influence. What did we call it in Europe? Where the king in waiting is really too young to really control the country. So the mom...
A regent.
A regent. Thank you. Couldn't think of it Sunday. Whatever. So yeah, she's the regent. We call her the dowager or whatever. Her names had shifted over the year. They knew her first as Orchid, then as Yi Hanala, then as Yi Concubine, then as Cixi, and then finally as Old Buddha as she got older, obviously. And so she's there, and for the most part, whatever skills she had in kind of like betting the emperor and then kind of making sure she was the number one, she had very good diplomatic skills. And there was like a hiatus from about 1870 to 1895 that because she was so good at diplomacy, she was able to kind of keep the coyotes at bay. And she was also able to keep enough influence and enough prestige on the Chinese court so that there wasn't a lot of internal changes either. But that sucks because China desperately needed some internal changes. But they didn't happen. And after a while, after this little hiatus, if you will, things start to go south again. Meaning that the Russians or not just the Russians, but the Europeans want more. They want more of the Chinese market. They want more concessions. They want more ports or whatever the case is. China is too vulnerable, and Cixi is now in a place where she really can't stop progress. So what ends up happening is, I have the list of like all these different things that happened to them between 1885 and 1900. It started with France, that gobbled up Indochina in 1885, completed, that regional thing. Used to be controlled by the Chinese dynasties. Britain took Burma, Portugal took Macau. The Japanese, and this was very, very kind of humiliating for the Chinese, is that their kind of regional rival, if you will, is now going to war against them and getting a whole bunch of concessions. And that was called the SinoJapanese War. And in the treaty, the Chinese lost Korea, they lost Liaodong, and then they also lost Formosa, which was ceded to Japan. Formosa, of course, is Taiwan now. Then Germany got a 99-year lease. Then Britain got another lease. Then they got a naval base. And then France got a base. And it was almost like the coyotes were just feasting now. It's like watching vultures like on the side of the road, and they're just ripping up carcass. And that's where the Chinese were. And you got to a place where they might as well have finished the job. And in fact, there was enough going on in European diplomatic circles. The Russians were coming down from the north. The Japanese were coming in from the Pacific. The Europeans were kind of hitting all of their bases. And that there was almost like a dialogue as, why don't we just partition off the thing? The Europeans had done the same thing in Africa. Why not do it here? And fortunately, the U.S. jumped in, and this was Secretary of State John Hay, which I believe was either McKinley's Secretary of State, I think that's what it was. It was McKinley's Secretary of State. Finally said, here's the diplomatic agreement. If any one part of China goes to one particular power, then it upsets an economic balance of power. We need to maintain Chinese territorial sovereignty for, if no other reason, than to make sure that that everybody kind of has equal access at this very rich and vast market. So they keep China as China, but then the only reason they did was to make sure that all of the coyotes could continue to feast, really unfettered, and that was the plan. And now, as they kind of confront this, China is like, look what's happening to us. We've got to do something. And what ends up happening is two things. One, there was an effort at some kind of internal reform movement, if you will. It says the humiliation of the defeat by Japan had increased or incensed young Chinese intellectuals who agitated for liberation from foreign dominance. Led by enlightened and concerned patriots such as Kang Yu-wi, the liberals proposed a wide-ranging series of economic, social, political, and educational reforms, and the young emperor, Susi's nephew, approved them. What followed came to be known as the 100 Days of Reform, where supposedly the liberals took over in China for a few days and were trying to make these massive changes towards modernization. But then the Empress Dowager was like, what's going on? And the Mandarin aristocracy, who knew that they were going to get nudged aside, started whispering in her ear, you need to get a hold of your nephew. And you need to watch this Kang Yu-wi dude because he's trouble. And so she jumps in. It says Susi and her advisors encourage anti-foreign sentiment and oppose the Patriots' attempts to bring about basic democratic reforms on a Confucianist basis. The reform attempts threatened the interests of Susi's supporters, and she came out of retirement, imprisoned her nephew, and revoked all of the reforms. What does that sound like? Anybody know about Russia? What did they do? Okay, reaction. All right? They needed reform, they ended up with reaction. And that was a bad missed opportunity. Except she thought she had something else that might work. That might, A, stop all of the people from agitating, and then B, get rid of all of this foreign influence. And as it turns out, it was an internal uprising called the Boxer Rebellion. Okay? And this is a big event, but basically this was a huge Chinese nationalist kind of uprising against everything foreign. And it was led by this group they called Righteous Harmony Fists. But they kind of did this exercise, so it was kind of like Tai Chi, were very slow, kind of, rhythmic movements. And they said when they saw them in the shadows, they looked like boxers. And that's why they got the nickname that they did. It says, at first they were strongly anti-Manchu, but by 1899 the chief object of their hatred had become the foreign nations who were stripping China of land and power. The Boxers started a campaign to rid China of all foreign devils. Many Europeans were killed. They started to seize control of the ports. They started to seize control of the embassies. And kind of quietly, like Susi's kind of like, yay, way to go. Which is sort of what the Russian Tsar was doing during the Kishinev pogroms. You guys remember? Where they found a target, they were going crazy, they said, you're the reason we're suffering. In Russia it was Jews, in China it was foreigners. And then the government can kind of step back and say, hey, you know what, yeah, it's not us being historically backward, it's these foreign devils. So you beat them up for us. And then we don't have to make any changes. And that's kind of where Tsar Nicholas and Susi, have a lot of common ground. Problem is, that's the wrong thing. The other thing is, do you think that the French, Japanese, British, and United States Navy might be able to defeat this uprising? And they did, and they squashed it, and they punished the perpetrators, and they imposed even harsher sanctions on China, and then they forced the Chinese to pay an indemnity to pay for the trouble of having to beat back the uprising. Now China's like, uh-oh, we're out of bullets, what do we do? And that's when old Buddha says, you know what, I think we need to make some reforms. Well, that's like Tsar Nicholas saying in 1917, hey, you know what, I think we probably needed to make some changes. Too late. And on the eve of World War I, there is a liberal uprising in China, a revolution that finally overthrows the Manchu dynasty. Okay? It's led by this guy named Sun Yat-sen. And so China declares itself a republic in 1912. Unfortunately, China's history mirrors Russia's history in a very major way. Because remember, if you go back 50 years, it was a massive peasant rebellion that kind of threw the country into revolt. A liberal revolution is not going to satisfy the peasants. And so that's what they get to contend with over the next 30 years. Does everybody understand? Okay, so far we've got India. India rises up and revolts, uses the Sepoy Mutiny, but India's sort of similar to Egypt in the sense that they don't really have the strength and power to completely overthrow the British influence. So the British embed themselves, and now they're kind of like a military power. All right? But the seeds for for decolonization are there. Egypt forms a national congress. India forms a national congress. They're going to get Western intellectually trained, and they will bring their people to the fore in the 20th century, particularly after World War I, and say, it's time for this influence to go away. China and Russia have very, very similar tracks, where they were feudal. They were kind of, unblemished feudal, and that their leadership refused to make the changes that might have avoided a really, really harsh revolution. Where does Russia end up in the 1930s? Under Stalin. Where does China end up in the 40s and 50s? Under Mao. And both of them were trained in, Marxist-Leninism, and imposed a very, very harsh brand of what the new thing was going to be. Japan did not. Japan encountered, remember, the U.S. at Commodore Perry. Remember, he showed up, said, hey, let's trade. They said, no soup for you. And he said, this is very disappointing. And then he went back, and then he returned, and he's like, we've got 3 warships that are now training guns on you. Will you trade with us? And Japan said, oh, yes. And they did. But now they're in that crossroads. They're like, what do we do? And their moment was modernize. They had a massive internal reform movement, and it covered really every basis. Okay? It's called the Meiji Restoration. And the idea was that we were going to modernize along Western lines, but at the same time try to maintain some control of Japanese culture. So we're going to do it along our own way. We're going to bring in some of these Western technicians, but once they've showed us what we need to make changes on, then we're going to boot them out. All right? We don't want to invite them in where they will never leave. So we will invite them in and control what the outcome is, and that's ultimately what happened. So politically, they ended up with, strangely enough, a constitutional government based on this idea called Bunmai Kaika, Civilization and Enlightenment, based on the readings of John Locke and J.J. Rousseau. Believe it or not, the Japanese, right around the time that that Europe was having its enlightenment, was having its own enlightenment. And they came to a lot of the same conclusions that the Europeans did. It's just that feudal Japan did not really allow those changes to kind of take hold. But there was at least a context there. There was a history or a background in understanding what modernization would look like if they ever got to that point. Okay? Ito Hirobumi is the prime minister, which means it's exactly set up the way England is set up, where they maintain control of their traditional leadership, meaning emperor. England always has, God save the Queen and God save the King and all that other crap. But the real power is really held by the prime minister. And Japan will functionally be the same way, just as Germany was. The real power, remember, was Bismarck, but they had a Kaiser. The real power in England is the prime minister, Disraeli and Gladstone, but everybody looked to Queen Victoria. And in Japan, the real power is Hirobumi, but they did look to the Japanese emperor. Feudalism is destroyed. Japan has a night of August the 4th. Okay? A civil war led by samurai opposition, and by the time it's all said and done, I think Tom Cruise was in a movie that was kind of highlighting some of this crap. You guys remember?
The Last Samurai.
The Last Samurai, there you go. But that type of thing, that structure that kind of held this samurai nobility as sort of figurehead leadership, that's all going to kind of come to an end in 1877. All right. The next thing is that they have what Gorbachev would talk about in the 1980s called restructuring. Gorbachev called it perestroika. Japan called it Fukoku Kyohei. Everybody knows that. Say it with me, class. Fukoku Kyohei. All right. So this is an economic and military restructuring which said, okay, our government might look like Germany's, but our economics are going to look like Britain's. And we're going to figure out what we do that we do better than everybody else, and we are going to mechanize it, and we are going to industrialize it, and we are going to urbanize it, and that's what they did. And they took their country in a space of about 30 years from an agriculturally backward kind of, farming and fishing, feudal aristocracy to an advanced, modernized, urbanized, industrialized country. Their silk industry became what Britain's textile industry was. And then they said, it's not enough. We got to build a navy. We've got to compete for trade. We've got to compete for bases. We got to compete for colonial influence. And then by the 1890s, they were playing that game. They were playing it in the Pacific and said, this is going to be our British Empire. It's going to be right here. Does everybody see what's going down? Okay. Last, let's talk about the Ottoman Empire and what happened there. And this is also kind of an interesting one. But they're kind of in the same boat as China. They're kind of in the same boat as Russia, that slowly but surely the Ottomans are kind of getting picked apart. It's not so much that like Western, businesses are coming in and taking from them, as much as it's internal nationalist rebellions. Now, what used to be the Ottoman Empire is shrinking because of nationalism. And the leadership, the Sultan and others that are looking at that Ottoman Empire are saying, what are we going to do? In the early 19th century, kind of maybe triggered off of Napoleon and the French Revolution, they kind of had one of those come to Jesus moments. After watching the French and the British battling it out in what used to be their territory, Egypt, they said, you know what? Egypt is going to look like everything that we have if we don't start making some changes. Okay? And so, as early as 1807, they finally had an enlightened absolute monarch, if you will. His name was Sultan Selim III.
Hi.
Okay? And Sultan Selim said, I am going to be your Catherine. I am going to be your Joseph II. We've got to modernize our army. We've got to make some internal political changes. We've got to change our civil service. We got to roll here, because if we don't, we're going to be an artifact. The problem is that the clergy, the ulama, and the Janissary Corps, which is basically the Ottoman feudal nobility, said, no. Because if you do those things, then we become obsolete or we lose our influence. And what happened to Sultan Selim?
They murdered him in his palace.
They killed him. All right? And the Ottomans missed an opportunity. Because there's a guy that might have been able to make those changes and do it in a way that was kind of slow and organic, so that the Ottomans would have been able to withstand, what was coming at them, which was nationalist uprisings, Serbs, Greeks, or whatever. And then also the intentions that Russia, for all practical purposes, wanted to consume the Ottoman Empire. And the British were more or less keeping the Ottoman Empire afloat to prevent the Russians from consuming the Ottoman Empire. All right? But the Ottoman Empire might have been strong enough in its own right if it would have made some of the internal reforms that it needed to do. There is a movement in the Ottoman Empire called Tanzimat, which is called reorganization. And this is where Ottoman intellectuals are starting to get together, liberals, kids that have been influenced by what went on in Western Europe, that had been influenced by what went on in the Enlightenment, that are saying the Ottoman Empire needs to modernize. Okay, we've got to find a sultan that is willing to do this, and we've got to find a way to figure out a way to get rid of the Ulema and the Janissary Corps, or at least force them to capitulate. Okay, because if we don't, we're in trouble. By 1876, that movement finally gets mature enough that they make a move. Okay? They have their 1848 revolution in 1876. I've mentioned that before, how Russia had their 1848 revolution in what year?
19 something, right?
When did Russia have its 1848 revolution? It was after the Bloody Sunday massacre. Anybody know? Right after they lost the Russo-Japanese War?
It was 1900 something.
1905. Good. Thank you. I feel so confident. Not a single one of you can get that. All right, so here's what happens. The leader, whatever you want to call him, the Robespierre, but not necessarily as psychotic as Robespierre, but the liberal that is leading this movement to make internal changes in the Ottoman Empire. His name is Mithat Pasha. All right? And a bunch of these folks say, you know what, we need to drive out the Sultan, we need to force the government into saying representative government, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. We're going to have our big liberal revolution. And so they overthrew Sultan Abdulaziz. They replaced him with who they believed was going to be the guy that was going to drag him in to the 19th century. His name was Abdul Hamid II. Then Abdul Hamid II pulled a Fred Bill 4 and said, you know what, thanks for the advice, guys, but I think I'm going to just maintain control here absolutely and autocratically. I appreciate it, though. And he bought some time because he did do some things that they mentioned. He was a pretty good diplomat. He had secured a political relationship with Kaiser Wilhelm. And then he was kind of preachy about pan-Islam. And he wanted to bring like all of the Islamic people together. He was like declaring himself the next caliph or caliph or however you pronounce it. And that he was going to be the guy, right? And so for a while everybody's kind of like, okay, Except, remember what's happening, and I'm going to talk about this on the second half of what we're doing when I talk about what's happening to the Ottoman Turks as Abdul Hamid II decides I'm internally going to stay backward and retro. That the Turks are in real trouble because the Balkans are just spiraling out of control. Okay. Finally, in 1889, there is a reckoning, if you will, with the fact that Abdul Hamid did not follow through on the changes that he said he was going to make. And this movement called the Committee for Union and Progress, known as the Young Turks, forms. And the Young Turks are not going to go quietly. Eventually there is going to be a need for something to change. And by the time we get to it, if you wanted just a name, it says the founder of the CUP at the Istanbul Imperial Military Medical College, that's where they got their start. These were medical students, was a guy named Ibrahim Timo, T-E-M-O. The group spread rapidly to military academy, the naval academy, the artillery and engineering school, the veterinary school, and the civil college. These are all military colleges or medical colleges or whatever. You're taking the elite. And all of these young, well-trained elite are now forming their own nationalist organization. And the goal, obviously, is that there's going to be some kind of revolution. The Sultan is going to get overthrown, and they're going to kind of create their own new government. And it said in 1908, it finally happened. A military revolt became the catalyst for the Second Ottoman Constitutional Revolution, known as the Young Turk Revolution. Support for the revolt spread rapidly, and the revolutionaries demanded Abdul Hamid reinstate the constitution. He acceded reluctantly to their demands. Elections were held, censorship was suspended, and the Young Turks relegated the Sultan to a position of secondary importance. Among the issues debated by the new assembly were rehabilitating the navy, reforming the police, and warding off attacks by the empire's neighbors. Reactionaries launched a counter-revolution in which Abdul Hamid was implicated in April, but they were put down by the army. Abdul Hamid was promptly deposed, and the CUP came to dominate the Ottoman constitutional regime. And that's kind of where we are as you lead into World War I. The Ottoman Empire still exists functionally, but they've already started to make the changes internally. And ultimately what ends up happening after World War I is Turkey forms out of the wake of what used to be the Ottoman Empire. But anyway, be familiar, Young Turks movement and that type of thing. There is a subject nationalities question, meaning that the Ottoman Empire, the CUP and the Young Turks Revolution is really Turkish nationalism more than it's, hey, let's keep the Ottoman Empire intact. And eventually it kind of tacks away from this old empire formation, and it's more just Turkish nationalism than anything else. Does anybody have any questions about any of this? You can see that the reactions are kind of different, but then there you can find some common ground. The Ottomans, the Russians, and the Chinese kind of have a similar tale. The Indians and Egyptians kind of have a similar tale, and then the Japanese were kind of like their own thing. And you could certainly make an argument that the most successful of all of these is Japan's. Japan was dramatic in how quickly they wanted to say, you know, it's time for us to join them if we can't beat them. And so ultimately they joined them. All of the others are going to face some pretty hardcore revolutions, whereas Egypt and India, which face another 60 years of pretty harsh colonialism. There's some neat things that happen, like in Egypt, for instance, when the guy's name is Evelyn Baring, they called him Lord Cromer, but when he became the military governor, you know, he did make some internal changes, and he was able to rule the country really until like 1907 or something like that. But there was an incident that they called the Dinshaway incident, and I don't know if I talked about it, but there's some weird stuff that goes down. Like, for instance, the Sepoy Mutiny. That was, you know, it's a hell of a way to start a massive rebellion, was animal cartridges. That was enough to set them off. The Egyptians had a massive uprising because the British were going around shooting their pigeons. Okay, and a lot of Egyptian villagers had like farmed pigeons for the purposes of eating those pigeons. And the British were like, no, this is fun, pigeon shoot. And they started running around the village like looking at pigeons to shoot. And the Egyptians are running out like, what the hell are you doing? And eventually the British ended up shooting one of the Egyptian villagers. And then they like kind of went Braveheart on them. You know, and said, you know, oh my God, pigeons, you have, you know. And then so they ended up killing a couple of British soldiers. And what do you think the British response was to the Dinshaway incident?
Beat it down?
Yeah, and then like literally kind of, you know, interview all of the villagers, and then they ended up hanging about 4 of them publicly. And it's just like, Britain, man, you got to stop doing this. Because every time you respond in this kind of harsh reprisal, this like Gestapo kind of thing, you're only going to intensify what ultimately is going to come to bear on them. All right? They can do whatever they want. They obviously act like they can do whatever they want. It's like, hey, pigeon shoot, cool. Without really even thinking about how that might impact people culturally. And the Egyptians were clearly, they were going to put that in their mental Rolodex. You know, kind of like the Irish, every time the British do something horrible to them. It's like, oh, okay, you remember. We'll talk about this one. And we're going to put that there, and we'll have about a dozen of these things that anytime we feel like we've got you guys in a vulnerable spot, there's going to be hell to pay. It's happening in India, it's happening in a lot of these different colonies. So, the only things that I didn't talk about were Persia and Afghanistan. And basically, the way that those two areas played out, and in Persia, there was a ruling dynasty called the Qajar. It's Qajar. But it's part of a battle that was going on between the Russians, which are literally the influence on that northern portion of those empires, and it's the British, who are pushing in from the bottom from India. And remember that what's taking place between the Russians and the British in the Eastern Mediterranean is also taking place around the area known as the Persian Gulf. So Russia's trying to influence entirely Persian affairs and control what goes on in Persia. The British eventually are going to push into Persia, and then both of them are kind of battling it out on who gets to gain control over the Persian Empire. And really the reason why the British are pushing it is not only to exploit them, eventually their oil and their influence, but it's also to make sure that the Russians don't move too far south, that they start controlling warm water ports in the Persian Gulf. So that's basically what it is. It's part of this diplomatic thing that goes on called the Great Game between Britain and Russia. And Britain and Russia are both literally pushing in. And Afghanistan and Persia, for all practical purposes, are still politically themselves, but economically, culturally, military, and in every other way, it's imperialistic rivalries where the Russians and the British are kind of almost like a pincer move, and they're kind of wedging in. And eventually, it's kind of like almost like a diplomatic deal. Once the Russians and the British start becoming friends after 1907, it's more or less we'll call a truce, and you control the northern half and we'll control the southern half. But it makes you wonder, because the Afghanistan, and we are kind of the caretakers to what took place in Afghanistan, but Russia, as late as the 1970s, was still trying to get influence in Afghanistan. Anyway, we'll talk about it later. All right, we're going to take a little break, about 5 minutes just to stretch, maybe go to the bathroom or whatever, and then we're going to do Origins of World War I, which are these notes called Origins of World War I.